This is Railway Conversations with Doc Frank and his guest, Mike Palmer.
Even the best CBTC training in the world arguably can get even better. And that's what's happened with the brand new 2024 Understanding CBTC Fundamentals training. This is an upgrade from the previous CBTC Kickstarter training that exists since 2014 and has been continuously refined, improved, and updated. You have a massive 30 video lessons that you can watch on demand as long as you live. You've got lifelong access. You can build a certifiable CBTC competency, and the certification is offered by me as well as an additional option. You do not need prior signaling knowledge for this training. Just imagine that you can learn the fundamentals of CBTC without needing to know anything about railway signaling before the training. So that really makes it suitable for anybody working in the railway industry and for anybody being interested in working in the railway industry. The training is topped up by an industry-leading Q&A support over at least 12 months. You can sign up for this fantastic training under docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC. And if you needed one additional argument, this course is actually cheaper than last year's training. So that's my way of helping you fighting inflation. Hope you enjoy, and I hope to see you at this CBTC training. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Frank. It's good to be here.
I wanted to talk to you for a long time. For one, because it's been absolute ages since we met the last time in Sydney. Seems like these days you are more often in Sydney than I am. But the other reason really was that you've got an almost unparalleled experience of implementing CBTC in at least 2 different countries, as far as I'm informed. So why don't you start telling us a little bit about your career so far related to CBTC, please?
Sure. Well, it's interesting you mentioned Sydney, because I've forgotten you were at that conference when I was a keynote opening speaker, which was February 2014 from memory, and I combined a vacation and my last day was speaking at the conference. And for those that know me, doing a 7 a.m. breakfast workshop, which is highly unusual for me to be up that early. What can I tell you about myself? I joined London Transport as it was in 1982. I failed one of my A-levels. I was going to be a teacher and I needed to retake the exam. A friend of mine worked for London Transport as a guard, and so I joined London Transport in September 82 as a guard on the district line. And I spent 2.5 happy years as a single man going up and down the district line 5 days a week. I always did 1 p.m. starts around there, so I could finish, go for a drink, go clubbing, go to bed and get up for my next shift. So it was a great kind of bachelor lifestyle. 2.5 years in, I got a lucky break and I went to work in control centres on a station manager 2 grade, which is unusual at the age of 22 to become a station manager 2. So there was lots of good pay there and promotion. And that was the start of my control centre career. So I did 2.5 years as what they called an information system, where in the control centre I passed out cancellations, out of turn, running delays to all the stations and made public broadcasts and set the dot matrix. And then after 4 years and 1 day of service, I did my controller training, the equivalent of dispatcher in the US or similar elsewhere. And that was unusual because I was the most junior person at that time. You had to have 4 years service to do the training. And I started on my 4th year and first day of service. And so I became the most junior controller on the underground. And there were eight lines in 4 divisions of 2. And I worked for C division mainly, which is the district and the Piccadilly lines. And I had a very happy time between 86 and 89 being a line controller and really having my own train service. It was like having a model train service, and I could send trains and divert trains and short-term trains. And it's one of those jobs where you either loved it or you hated it. You had to have that mind of being able to retain information, recall it quickly, and see this massively moving puzzle of 60 odd trains in service, all running late, out of turn and maintaining service. And I did that until 1989. I then went into a duty manager, kind of a mobile role for the Piccadilly and Member District Line, which was troubleshooting trains in trouble, going to incidents, suicides, writing up reports on all sorts of stuff, interviewing drivers and guards for disciplinaries, and so on. And then I became what they called a service manager, where I was a shift boss for 2 lines up until about 95 on shift, but I was the most senior person on the 2 lines to make service calls. In 95, my real lucky break was to work on the Jubilee Line extension. So I was asked to help my then boss, Howard Collins, who is well embedded in Sydney, as you know. And that was to open the new control centre at Neasden for the Jubilee Line extension and the new yard control tower in Stratford in East London. So we opened that, and in 2000, I got bored with a steady state railway. I kind of like problematic things with a challenge. And so I moved out of there, and I did 2.5 years running a train division of drivers, which was probably the most thankless job I did in my 29 years at LU. In 2005, I was asked to go onto 2 projects. One was a 7-car project for the Jubilee Line, where we increased the size of the trains from 6 cars to 7 cars, which was an immediate uplift in 17% of capacity. And on the Jubilee and Northern Line project was to re-signal both lines with brownfield CBTC. In fact, it was Alcatel who became Thales and now Hitachi with their CellTrack 40 system. I was what they called the user acceptance manager. So I was the lead operator, and any operational decision around functionality, scope, front end came through me and no one else. I had to sign everything off. And that was about change management, scope creep, the voice of the operator, a single voice. And we commissioned the Jubilee Line in 2010-11. And I left London Underground in 2011 on what they call voluntary redundancy. So London Underground paid me to resign. And I left with a shed load of money, and I took 9 weeks off, which is highly recommended to anyone who hasn't had 9 weeks off. And when I joined Thales, the company doing the signalling, but now on the supplier side, so I was now on the other side of the table looking after the interests of the operator. And I had a great time on a traffic management project where Network Rail in the UK, the infrastructure owner and operator, were going to consolidate 680 cabins down to 12 regional centres, initially 14. And those 12 centres over one life cycle of signalling would dispatch the whole of England, Scotland and Wales. And then in late 2013, I had a call from Andy Byford, train daddy to some, of Sydney and New South Wales trains alongside Rob Mason, the TTC, MICT, London, and so on. And he asked me to apply for a job he had posted for Deputy Chief Operating Officer at the Toronto Transit Commission. So I applied, I got the job, and I moved here to Toronto in April 2014. And I had just under 4 glorious years working for Andy, initially as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer and then the COO. So I was effectively a shared number 2 in the company. And half of my day job was to run the railway and maintenance of buses and streetcars for a while, and revenue collection and infrastructure. But the other half was projects. So that was bringing in one-person train operation as a prototype, because Toronto still has guards on trains. On only one of the lines now. So open the TYSSC extension and to help rescue the ATC project, the CBTC brownfield project on line 1. So I'd say probably half of my time was spent day to day improving service, reliability and infrastructure, and the other half was on projects. The TTC are not known for their projects. Essentially, line 1 had been extended, but had stood still technology-wise other than the rockets, which came along, I think, in around 2011. So that's my background. Andy left in December 2017. I left in April 2018. I now work for Parsons, one of the engineering consultancies. I'm one of the few operators there. And just to remind everybody, I'm speaking tonight in a personal capacity, even though Parsons has given me permission to do the podcast, because these are my personal views. They're not views of Parsons or any agency that we work with.
That's exactly how I like it, that you give me your own personal views. What's interesting and why I'm so interested in especially your knowledge of CBTC is that I've been doing trainings on CBTC for 10 years now. in all honesty, without having done a CBTC project back to back. It was just when I started dealing with CBTC, I had a very hard time learning that stuff. Information was extremely scarce. If you looked it up on Google at the time, the first thing that came up was the Cardiff Business and Technology Center as an explanation of CBTC. So that was kind of the level of information that you got. And once I learned about CBTC, I thought I want to make it easier for other people to learn about CBTC. So I developed a training course, which was very successful since 2014. And what I like doing when I have the opportunity is to basically compare notes with experts who really walk the walk, like yourself. With regards to Toronto, I don't want to go too much into detail there, but you said you had to rescue that project, CBTC, on Toronto Line 1. What was, in your view, the biggest issue there? I have an idea what it is because I'm using Toronto Line 1 actually as a case study in my trainings. But what was the biggest problem that needed resolving from your point of view?
So I'm going to come back to something you said about the history of CBTC and its origins, because I have I have knowledge and a view on that. In terms of Toronto, they started out with one contract back in 2008 for 3 interlockings. It's the original 3 interlockings when Line 1 opened in 1955, which was Union, Bloor and Davisville. And that was fine. Replaced 3 interlockings with 3 new CBIs at life. And then another 6 contracts came along in, and I'm going from the list so I do it correctly. In 2009, they commissioned Alstom to do CBTC and 39 trains, which is what they had at the time. 2011, another contract for another 21 trains to be fitted with CBTC cardboard controllers. In 2012, they put tender out for more interlockings, CBI interlockings. And also in 2012, they gave the contract for the TYCC extension interlockings. In 2013, they asked for another 10 trains to be fitted because they kept increasing the order of rockets by another 10. And in 2014, another contract for the final 10 trains, making 80. So all 80 rockets were fitted with CBTC. The early trains came with no onboard equipment because the contracts were not aligned, but the later trains arrived with the Alstom cardboard controller and all the wiring, the tachometers and the accelerometers and so on, the power supply already installed. There was an 8th contract for the yard at Wilson, which was given to Thales. So when I arrived in April 2014, there were 7 mainline contracts with 3 different suppliers. Well, 8 in total with Thales doing the yard. In August 2014, I travelled to the US to a centre of excellence for the 3rd supplier, doesn't matter who it is. And after that visit, I came to the conclusion that we couldn't carry on. And there were 3 reasons, 2 are irrelevant to this conversation really, which is about reliability and speed and capacity. But the 3rd one was that the interlockings provided by this 3rd supplier were not compatible with the Alstom CBTC system. And what I think probably happened is that the commission thought, well, they will be in time. And, you know, the supplier said, yes, they're compatible, which probably meant no, but we've got 5 years to work it out. And so one of the main drivers was there was no end game. We could commission the interlockings, but the ATC overlay would not work with these brand new interlockings. And so at some point very quickly, I'd be ripping them out, perhaps only a year or 2 old. And so what I did when I got back was I spoke to Andy Byford as my COO, and we decided to consolidate the contracts on the main line from 7 to 1, and for the yard from 1 to 1. 2 contracts instead of 8. But it meant that a supplier had to fall by the wayside. And so I terminated reluctantly in February, March 2015, one of the 3 suppliers. And we reset the contract on the 30th of March 2015. 1 supplier for the main line, 1 supplier for the yard. And that simplification of the project meant that there was an end game and suddenly it was much easier. And so my director of ATC, Pete Tomlin, who's worked with me in London and in Toronto, and I've known him since the 90s, was my project director, and we moved forward on the same schedule and the same cost as the original contract. And so we had the test track open within 18 months of the notice to proceed with Alstom to do the mainline CBTC in full. We had within the 18 months the first shadow section and the test track both going, and we opened our first section temporarily just to get drivers familiar in probably mid 2017, early 2017. Two and a bit years after we signed a contract and we started again from scratch, ripping out old brand new interlockings, as it turned out. And then the first proper section went into service in December 2017, and that was a TYSC. So it was one greenfield section, the rest was brownfield. And we persuaded the TYSC management team to let us re-signal it. There's going to be this weird scenario of a brand new extension having old signaling and the old line having brand new signaling. And that just didn't make sense. And so Pete and I took on the extra section and we delivered it to within 1 second of time on the promised day. On the Sunday morning at 7 a.m., 2 trains were due to meet at a station called Pioneer Village, going north with the city, coming south with North York. And so kind of a Glasnost moment as all the celebrities and VIPs and politicians from the 2 municipalities met on the platform and shook hands. And we delivered it on the day we promised. And the trains arrived within 1 second of each other in ATO with the doors opening. And that was really the start of a success, which turned line one successful. We did slip about a year, and that's because taking on the extra section took its toll. And the first section was new. Prime Minister Trudeau was opening it on a Friday morning. But I think the project was completed after I left, and it was probably about a year late. And for me, a year late in brownfield CBT is world class. It's not at the bottom; it's near the top, because a lot of agencies bite your arm off to only be a year late with CBTC and all of its challenges when you're trying to run a railway Monday to Friday at least.
I think there are several important lessons to be learned from that project. You mentioned the complexity by the sheer number of contracts with the different suppliers, and you also explained quite eloquently how things got better very quickly once you had consolidated those contracts and you had a single supplier that is clear what needs to be done. So to me, in hindsight, it looked like a series of sensible procurement decisions, which, however, were not coordinated. So I'm pretty sure when they gave the
isolation of each other, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So when they led the initial interlocking contracts, I'm pretty sure they did a proper due diligence on the suppliers, and they chose what they thought was the best interlocking supplier. And then only a year later, they did a different procurement and chose what I'm sure they thought was the best possible CBTC supplier, based on a promise of the supplier that the interface, as you mentioned, between interlocking of one supplier and CBTC of the other supplier could make to work. And that was the missing link that never happened. And I think you said that was the outcome from your meeting there with one of the suppliers, that you basically came back and said that interface will likely never work. And
well, it wouldn't work. They admitted that it wouldn't be compatible with the Alstom system. So in a sense, I had no choice.
Yes. But I mean, the original promise was that the interface would work between one supplier's interlocking, and I'm trying to avoid the names here, but I mean, you already slipped one. So the other thing I think here, and that's also related to procurement, is really the due diligence of suppliers. And I thought from the pre-discussion we had and from your email you sent me afterwards that you've got more to say about that. To basically ask a question like, will your interlocking be compatible to a CBTC? The client, meaning somebody else's CBTC, possibly the supplier saying yes on the basis, well, yes, if it's our own CBTC, surely it will work. So let's go into due diligence of suppliers for a moment. What would you think there is a good way to make sure that you don't have any nasty surprises down the line?
So certainly in Canada, and definitely in Toronto and Ontario, you're obliged to take the lowest compliant bid. And so it's a two-stage process, the actual bid and a second envelope with the price. And you should never open the second envelope unless they're compliant. You should just shred it and you'll never know what the value was. And I've seen projects here where they did open the second envelope and were swayed by price rather than compliance to the
Yeah.
contract. And so all of the bidders were the lowest compliant price. And I think with the interface between the two, it would be a reasonable assumption to believe that the outputs of an interlocking in terms of switch position and point position could be interfaced. And what I think probably happened was they said yes rather than no, but we've got 5 years to think about it and work it out, which I would probably do as well, because you've got that time, but time is the enemy. I also think that the only similarity between the old system and the new system is the controller switches. Nothing else is the same. New signals, axle counter secondary detection, radio-based communication for train positioning. The only subsystem that both systems shared was control of the switches, and either the old or the new could be in control, not both. And so I think that assumption was flawed. And because there was no end game at the time, I'm sure had they had time, they would have worked it out. But that's not the point. We hadn't commissioned anything, and we'd resisted commissioning for a year, 18 months. And the first couple of interlockings were ready, but I just couldn't pull the trigger because there was no end game. There was no solution at the end of it. And just that streamlining, we did due diligence, and the bids were compliant. But I think there's no point in pointing the fingers at suppliers because they were bidding against the contract set out.
I think what often the problem is that the client, which is the railway organization, has an interest in the procurement process to get multiple compliant bids. So their best interest is that all the suppliers are compliant. So when they ask a question like,
Agree. See, I disagree with that. I
okay,
think non-compliant is the thing. So if you put out an RFP for a new CBTC system, it is highly unlikely that any supplier is going to be fully compliant with what you put in an RFP.
yeah,
And a lot of RFPs are too long. I think good RFP is probably between 5 and 10 pages. You have to describe what you want. And then it's for the supplier to tell you whether they're not compliant. Any supplier that says they're fully compliant, I'd kind of think, are you sure about that? And so I don't want them to be compliant. I want them to tell me what the differences are so we can then have a basis for discussion and see where the non-compliant sits and whether I could live with that. And if I can't live with it, they're going to change their baseline system, which I'm against because I want to buy something that's close to the baseline as possible. And I don't want to be an early prototype of a new system. British Airways, useless fact number one, only buy aircraft construction number 100 or above. They are not interested in being the launch customer for the Dreamliner or a Max or anything else. And you saw the headlines for both as to why you shouldn't be it, because they want a stable product. And I'm the same. I want a stable CBTC system, which is cute and innovative, but it's not brand new. And I'm not the guinea pig for a supplier to see how it works.
well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you've been on the supplier side as well. I'm not sure whether you were involved in bidding process, but if you work for a supplier, you try to win a bid, and you come up with what could be seen by the client as problems, i.e., well, we're not fully compliant, let's talk about this. But then you may have a competitor which basically says, yeah, it will all be fine. We will sort it. We will sort it out. So by being honest with you, they may put themselves in a disadvantageous situation regarding winning the bid. Yeah, by saying, well, these guys seem to be less compliant than the other guys, so we just go with the other guys. And then only, I don't know, 3 years later, you find out that they have kind of hoodwinked you or put wool over your eyes or so.
By which point it's too late. And you've fallen for the naivety of a supplier saying, yeah, we can do that and we can do that and we can do that.
Yes.
And I don't want them to do. I want them to tell me what they can't do. And then you meet in the middle. You either go off piste and do something bespoke, or you accept it's non-compliant, but it still does the job. So I didn't actually, when I worked for Thales, I didn't work on any bids to do with the Transport for London, but I did work on a bid for another small subway somewhere in the United Kingdom. And it was very prescriptive from the agency. A small agency, never done this before since probably the 70s. And so we were asked if we would put in a code, some sort of functionality where the system would know when to wash a train. And my response is, yeah, we can do that. It's an algorithm which knows when it was last washed and so on. I said, personally, I'd look out the window, and if a train was dirty, I'd wash it, or I'd have a whiteboard in the corner with the dates of all the times the units were last washed. And so agencies in asking for all this stuff are going into unknown territory, and it's scope creep, and it's money for the suppliers.
Yeah.
And actually, I push back on things like that, saying, are you sure you really want that? Because I'm not sure that standard might be a great idea in your head, but do you really need it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the risk. See that clients think they get a proven product, but by definition of their own requirements, they enter territory where they will be the world first for certain features, not for the entire product, of course, but for certain features, and that may cause them more trouble than it actually brings them benefits. So by you from a client position saying you don't want to be the launch customer, what you would probably ask suppliers during a tender process, well, firstly, you would get suspicious if a supplier said, yeah, we are fully compliant, because you said, yeah, that's probably not 100% true. Yeah, so let's find out what the real deal is. And then secondly, you will probably ask a follow-up question, well, have you done this before? And if the answer to that is no, then you know that you would be the launch customer, you would be the world first. And then you could still decide whether that requirement was really that important, or whether you said, you know what, I rather take something off the shelf to the extent possible that's been proven elsewhere, and do away with that, for example, the train wash feature that you mentioned.
So in North America, generally these days, an agency will ask for 3 reference sites where you've done similar work within North America, preferably as recent as possible. And in some ways that's good because it's evidence based. That shows you've done it before. I think it also shows up the problem of the consolidation in the industry, where you're down to 3 or 4 main suppliers, the usual Siemens, Hitachi, Thales. Thales before it became Hitachi, and perhaps a 4th one in the US with some overseas one as well. But if a North American agency says, I want 3 reference sites in North America, you've either done it or you haven't. You could say I've got 1 or 2, some have none. And there are signaling suppliers who are not from North America trying to enter the market, have a real problem getting in there because of this block of 3 reference sites. But I think it's still a good test of how solid your product is. And I would always talk about touching and feeling it. So you touched on choosing your supplier. When we terminated the supplier in February, March 2015, I took my AC project director, Pete Tomlin, and a couple of my team, along with some Alstom guys, and we visited Mexico City, line 12, and Panama City, line 1, because they were the nearest Alstom Herbalist 400 reference sites to Toronto. So Toronto was the first US-Canadian project for Alstom with Herbalist, and it was their first brownfield, I think, worldwide. And so we were working with a supplier new to what Pete and I were used to. And we had a mad 72 hours flying on a Monday morning, spending Monday night in Mexico City. We left at 6 a.m. Tuesday to Panama City, and we left Panama City Wednesday afternoon and got back at midnight Wednesday night. I mean, we did thaw out after kind of minus 20 in Toronto for 2 nights, but we were absolutely shattered, and we did loads of miles. And one of the reasons I took my team was I wanted to touch and feel Herbalists, which I hadn't been able to do before, but also talk to Mexico City Transit Agency and Panama City Agency. And we had private sessions with them away from Alstom, where we said to them what Alstom like to deal with, what problems have we had with them, and so on. And we were shown around their line and their interlockings. And so we got to see it and touch it and feel it and actually talk peer to peer and what they found. And I have to thank Mexico City as a transit agency, because they stayed behind on a Monday evening to spend an hour and a half with us, which is very generous in terms of their time. But at the end, we asked them, what's the one thing you would do differently? As a user of Herbalist on line 12, what would you do differently? And their response, which I treasure to this day, was we had too elaborate a backup. So their backup was signals, train stops, block joints, every 100 meters mimicking fixed block, but it was a backup to Herbalist. And they admitted that it was expensive, it drove up risk, and it was never used. Because these days, the fastest way to recover your system if you have a zone controller failure is to restart the zone controller and move your trains to safety rather than fiddle around with the backup to get trains into platform safely. Because while you're moving trains, you can't restart the zone controller because it gets confused if trains are moving as it tries to re-establish positions. And so that was a really valuable lesson. And we did it intentionally. So we went into replacing the contract, resetting it with Alstom with our eyes wide open about what we were walking into.
Yeah. Yeah, backup is another interesting thing that's often, I think, mishandled or misunderstood by the client. Normally, they introduce CBTC to raise capacity on the system beyond what's possible with conventional signaling. But then they introduce a backup system for the sake of having a backup system, and the backup system has to be conventional signaling. But the backup system will not be capable of handling the capacity that CBTC gives you. So when you operate CBTC and you pump, say, 30 trains per hour through the system, and for whatever reason you have a very rare system failure, you're left with a backup system that's only designed for, I don't know, say 20 trains per hour, trying to handle 30 trains within 1 hour that you have in the system. So you will always have problems with that. From a performance point of view, you probably also can tackle only very limited selected failure scenarios with that backup system. So all up, I'm with you that it's, and I think meanwhile it's best practice in the industry to focus on making the primary system, the CBTC system, as reliable as possible, so that you minimize your downtime in the first place and you are able to bring it back into operation as quickly as possible and then run your normal service again after the disruption, of course.
So I have a different view of backup to a lot of people. You know, when we started visiting other networks, we went to Docklands Light Rail in London, which we weren't benchmarked against. You know, that wasn't our baseline system. And they talked about this special feature they had in the middle of the room, which is this separate terminal, and it was essentially a station control emergency gateway. And they said to us, we're the only ones that have got it, and it gets us out of trouble. So if your system goes down, a zone controller goes down, you might have a fifth of your trains all being simultaneously, losing communication with the mothership. You have to restart the process and enter them. That was designed to get trains into platforms. And so your worst scenario from a safety point of view in an underground system is trains stuck between stations with the power off, hundreds of people, it's very hot. You want to move that train into platforms. If it's plain line to the next platform moving forward, or there's one just behind you, you can do that. As soon as you have switches, you've got to somehow get trains over switches which are locked. And so the station controller gateway was designed for you to go into the back door of the station controller and move switches manually, and then the train to move manually into stations. I've never seen a backup as an alternative to running CBTC. It's your get out of jail card. We went to Hong Kong and we went to Westrail and we looked at Westrail and they had this thing in the middle. I said, so what is that? And I said, oh, it's very special, only we've got it. Yeah, right. It's the station control emergency gateway. So London Underground and Tube Lines, who were the infrastructure P3 partners, said, we want that. And so we had what we call degraded mode control, which is very similar, moving the switches. Now in London, there were no signals. There were just signs, stop signs, replacing semi-automatic signals. And so all your moves were done under rule, but you could still move the switches to secure a route and know it wouldn't move. But it was never used in London because by the time you'd moved all your trains into platforms, you were itching to restart the processor, which you couldn't do while trains were still moving. So you had this really stark choice. What's the fastest way to recover? And the fastest way to recover is to restart the zone controller and re-enter trains, however quick that is, and you can cherry pick. But it was to stop trains being stuck underground with facing switches that couldn't be moved. when it came to Toronto, we took a piece of middle ground that was really for engineers' vehicles, work trains, which weren't initially going to be fitted. And we changed the contract so all work cars that could be would be fitted with CBTC. And I think that's the norm now. Any supplier that says no, you would have to question as to why they weren't prepared to fit CBTC equipment to work cars, not for ATO, but to drive manually with a target speed and target distance. The big thing is to know where your trains are, not how far you want them to go, because you can always authorize a driver to go so far and so fast. But if you don't know where they are, because
Yeah.
you don't have a backup secondary train detection, that's terrible. And Vancouver SkyTrain don't have a secondary. Their diagram at night is blank. There could be 10 work trains out there, but they don't know they're there. They have a whiteboard and they write them all in and they send them out behind each other with the furthest ones going first, because once they stop and work, they block everything beyond it. And that's fine, that works for them. But the other thing you said was about reliability and availability. The reality is that CBTC has high reliability and high availability, way larger than conventional systems. The only downside is it's a bit all or nothing. It either works or it doesn't. And when a zone controller goes down, or when the train control system, the SMC for Thales cell track goes down, you're busy, but it quickly recovers. And the capacity is what, 30, 33, 36 trains an hour. Before the Jubilee, when it was limited to 24 trains an hour, and it's now 30, 32. So that increase in capacity is tremendous. But then you have to think about what are the other constraints, because what happens is things overtake each other. So you buy a new signaling system, great, but you don't have enough trains to really, you know, harvest that extra capacity. You run out of trains. Or if you have enough trains and new signaling, your terminal stations are not designed for high speed run-ins. And so you have trains going across diamonds at 15 miles, 20, 25 miles an hour. And that slows you down because you can't physically get 30 trains in and out, even at that speed, because it's just so slow. And then you need more power. And so all these things come together and you have to consider them all in your signaling renewal. Otherwise, the worst constraint will always hold you down. And I think that happens a lot.
That's such an important insight for brownfield railways, especially where the railway wants to introduce CBTC for improving capacity, and they hear these fantastic things of CBTC
Reliability.
running.
Reliability.
Yes, yes, yes. That's a side effect which often proves to be even more impressive than the capacity increase. But with regards to capacity, you mentioned a couple of very, very important points. One is you really need to look at the entire service cycle. So if you can run 40 trains per hour on the open line, but your turnbacks can only do 24, you're stuck at 24 because you can't just turn around enough trains that you get into the terminus.
I think you're right, but you're supposing that all the service goes end to end. So on the larger lines, and the Elizabeth line in London is a good example, they built auto reversing at Paddington. And so a turnback at Paddington, which goes into one of three pocket tracks beyond the station, but before the Network Rail boundary going out towards Reading and Heathrow Airport. The driver sets the train in auto turnback and they depart the train and they then walk through the train while it drives itself to a turnback and back into Paddington station on the other platform, by which time the drivers walk 9 cars and they're ready at the other end. What a lot of agencies do is short-check. Where they have a shortage of trains, and the Jubilee line is a good example, trains are short-turned at both ends of the line because their focus was a higher core TPH through the centre of London. And so there are always sacrifices to make. And if the most important thing for an agency is a high capacity through central London, then you're going to short turn at the north end and the east end. But then you get delays at those places. So a train has to get all the people off, the driver has to go back and check the train, then it goes into the siding, and by which point you've got 2 trains stuck behind it. And so in a way, you're picking your poison as to what's most important, but also how the agency deal with it. If you had 6 station staff at a turnback and each did 1 car and the driver didn't have to leave a cab, you could be out of that station in 30 seconds. But if they're not there, because there's no business case for it, and the driver has to leave the cab to check the train, which is correct because people could fall in between, then you're negating the benefit of a short turn, even if it gives you a high capacity going in the other direction. And it's because People think if you buy a new signaling system and on new trains, your problems are solved, and often they're not.
Yeah, that was in fact the second point that I wanted to make. That
Ah,
for improving capacity, people focus or tend to focus on the tightest constraint, which is normally signaling. And then they often make the additional thing, well, if I want to run more trains, I need more trains. So they get a new signaling for higher capacity, they buy themselves more trains. But often what happens is that other capacity constraints that were lurking in the background or hiding behind the signaling constraints are suddenly in the limelight. So it could be that you don't have enough traction power to run the trains that the signaling system would allow you to, and all the trains that you bought, and you don't have enough traction power. So that certainly becomes your constraint. Or it's the turnbacks, or it's the processes how to change ends with a train, and basically from entering this terminus station or a turnback to being able to pull out again in the other direction, stuff like that. So I think your point is what I wanted to emphasize, really, to look at the entire system and not just, oh, we're fixing that one signaling constraint with a high capacity system, and now overnight we will have a high capacity railway. And that's just not the case, right?
so I think most of the things you've mentioned you can mitigate against. So if you're talking about fast turnarounds at the end, you step back, you have a spare crew, and so a driver gets off, another driver gets in the right end, and it can depart in 20 seconds. And then that driver changes ends. There are things you can double end trains in and out of siding, put spare crews on, and take it into the siding back out again without an interruption. You've missed the most important, actually, one, and there's evidence of this from Canada and London, and that is dwell times. So modelling is rarely accurate. And modelling assumes, say, a 20-second dwell at a station. And I know, a line, it doesn't matter where roughly it takes 8 seconds from train stop to the door being fully open in ATO. And the same for the door to close. And that's 16 seconds of your 20-second dwell where people aren't actually getting on and off the train. And so I think one of the issues, particularly at busy stations, is the inability to maintain dwell times. If you have a 30 or 40-second dwell on a 120-second headway, you're not going to achieve it, because 40 seconds, 1/3 of your headway is taken up with people getting on and off. And so the run in, run out times and the will start to will start means you're never going to achieve it unless you improve your throughput. You could argue that with more trains, your boarding and alighting should be more efficient and so on, but that's not always the case. But fundamentally, if you want to operate 30 trains an hour plus, you can't be having 40-second dwells at central London stations, because you can see the trains losing time. In Toronto, when I arrived in April 2014, I resisted going into the control centre for a couple of months because of my background. I didn't want to revert to time and go into my comfort zone. And I just said to my deputy at the time, how late are we? And he said, 40 minutes. And I went, what? And he went, oh, that's pretty good. That's normal from Monday to Friday. And what had happened is for a number of years, perhaps 10 years, the run times and dwell times had never changed, even with new trains and with more people using the system. And so it was normal for trains to run 40 late in the morning peak and then just renumber them all at the crew relief point so they're back on time, despite the fact that journey times were longer and you missed all of these north to south because of, short tripping is cancellations. It's lost kilometrage. And there was an acceptance that that was normal late running, which I found bizarre. And so your schedule and your dwell times and your run times have to be accurate and fit the purpose. And that goes back to the modelling and the accuracy and what I would call operational biased optimism. You think everything's going to be fine, your modelling shows it to be fine, and you've got all these plans, you still don't achieve it on the day.
Yeah, the thing is with modeling, you often only have dwell times from basically wheel stop to wheel start, assuming that the dwell time would actually be equal to your actual passenger exchange time. But as you just mentioned, that's often very, very different, especially when platform screen doors come into play. because you do have technical times required from wheel stop to the actual opening of the doors, including the coordination between the train doors and the platform screen doors. And then at the end of the dwell time, you've got the same process for closing the doors and securing that they are closed, confirming that they are closed before the wheel can start rolling again. So there's a technical aspect of dwell time control, but there's also a human aspect of dwell time control where the station staff basically can't just keep up with the old ways. There's a granny with a pram coming with the grandchild in it. We're just gonna wait until she is boarded, and if you've got like 30-second dwell time, the train's got to leave after 30 seconds. And if you come from a brownfield in a brownfield railway from a legacy system where the staff gave a bit more leeway to delays from allowing passengers to board, passengers with disabilities or with a pram or whatever, it's a huge cultural change both for the staff and for the passengers as well. Yeah.
So there's an old saying, which I don't fully agree with, it says people wait for trains, trains don't wait for people. And in a way that's right. If people, it isn't the station staff, they work really hard to dispatch trains on time. They see the signal is clear, or the indication we put on JNUT, the station staff could see the driver had a target point and target speed to depart. And people kept running for the train. People kept blocking the train doors. So actually, I think the station staff do the best they can. But the reality is, if you're 30 seconds is too long, Frank. If you want to do 120 seconds, you're assuming that you've got 90 seconds only to run in, run out, and let the next train reoccupy the platform track. And that's probably not possible. But if you can get the trains away in 20 seconds, knowing the next one is sitting outside waiting, and you can see it on CBTC like Loyang in Toronto, probably Baker Street or Canary Wharf on the Jubilee line, probably Waterloo on the Northern line in London. You can see people running for the train, and what they should be doing is shutting the doors and getting out, because the next train, you can see the headlights of the next train, behind you in the tunnel, and yet people still run for that train because they've got to get that train. And it's almost a badge of honor where people block the doors and try and get on.
Yeah. They're
set of problems with train dragging and so on.
Yeah, they're 5 seconds of playing Superman. Yeah, that they can squeeze the doors open.
Because you've just delayed their service by 5 extra seconds. And by the way, at the next station, that's 7 seconds of worth of extra people. And that train then starts to lose time over time. And people wonder why it ends up 5 minutes later at the end of the line. Because one person blocked the door for a few seconds. Yeah. It's devastating, the impact in the peak in particular.
Yeah.
I don't know. So the station staff do really well in trying to get the trains away. The drivers try and do well. If you've got people running for the trains with different entrances onto the platform, there's no good time to shut the doors. You've got to pick a sweet spot, which might be a split second. And by the time you press the door close and the doors start to close, you're beyond that spot and people are running for the train again. And so I don't know what the answer is, truly. Platform edge doors are strange. When the Jubilee Line extension opened, we had some instances where the driver got a door close visual, so they proceeded, but a ped door was stuck open. So very quickly we had to put an additional wayside indicator, because the PEDs didn't talk to the signalling system, because it was manual driving and fixed block initially. They had to check the wayside to see the PED doors were closed as well. And only with doors closed and PED doors closed in the tunnel were they allowed to depart. Otherwise, you had a PED door left open and people, potentially injury.
I would like to talk to you briefly about the culture change, because you worked on brownfield projects. All the CBTC projects you worked on from memory were brownfield projects. Where
3 brownfield, but Toronto Line 1 had one section which was greenfield, which was interesting in its own right.
Yes, but the majority of the operation, so it was an existing railway for the majority of the line. So basically the whole system, both from the railway staff point of view, also from a passenger point of view, were used to the old world of lower capacity. And now you're introducing CBTC, a high capacity signaling system. But what's really required is a culture change of the entire railway system, including the passengers, to a high capacity railway. The signaling system itself just doesn't cut it, and we just established that. What how did you perceive this need for a culture change, and how problematic did you find it to re-educate the passengers that it's no longer necessary to basically run for the train, squeeze the door open, because the next one will follow in a much shorter period of time than previously in the old system before you had CBTC? Or I don't know, educating your station staff that the dwell times are now measured by the second and not by the minute, and the departure times are now on a per second basis, and so on. So what can you say about culture change and any challenges there?
So, firstly, I would like to congratulate you on the longest ever question I've been asked, taking over 90 seconds for one question. So, I'm going to rewind a bit and unpick it. I don't blame customers. Customers don't know there's a new signaling system. They might be aware because of all the closures. But from the customer point of view, nothing changes on the surface, even though over time they might perceive it's a better service, faster service. Don't forget, with CBTC, you can run faster. So your interstation journey times are shorter. And so you can get the same number of trains working harder and delivering you more trips per hour. In terms of a change, I partly disagree with you, I'm afraid, again, because it's the same railway, it's the same passengers, it's the same staff, it's the same trains, it's the same stations. The only thing that changes is the signalling. One of the things I did get wrong in London was I thought the change to the rule book would be this big, this whole new rule book, massive, because of the way CBTC or TBTC in London would change it. And in fact, in reality, the rule book was that big and it was just an appendix, because a lot of the signaling functionality doesn't change how you deal with a suicide or a wrong directional move or a signal overrun or a platform overrun. You know, you still have your existing processes that get you out of trouble and resume the service. And so what I would say is you really have to consider what the delta is between the old system and the new system. And it's one thing, well, two things: signaling and automatic train running. Because generally under fixed block you don't have automatic. I mean, you do, but it's a clunky version because it's fixed block. And so I think you have to keep both feet on the ground and really focus on the things which are different for the CBTC line. Faster trains, faster journey time, shorter dwells, turnbacks being quicker, but they're all signaling related. It's that impact the signaling has on them that makes them easier, harder, or faster or slower to do. And their impact is more felt under CBTC. You know, I always say that if you're dispatching or controlling a CBTC line, you have to be really fast. You have to be so fast. You have to get in really quickly and shut the door. Number one rule of controlling, I learned in London Underground, is shut the door. If you're in trouble, you stop trains entering the affected area. You do code reds, whatever you want to call it. You put signals back at danger. You do a general message, you know, on the radio. I can remember I was called, you know, back in the late 80s. I would get a driver call in, say, Mayday, Mayday, I've got one under Green Park West. I immediately shout to all of the dispatchers in the room, one under Green Park West. That's all I had to say. And all these dispatchers would start putting everything into push button. They put signals back at danger. You know, they do anything they could to stop trains, because every train that was stuck between stations, particularly near the suicide train, was another monkey on your back you had to sort out. A train full of people, you had to walk out, and you walk them out, because if you start walking them, you can't stop it. I mean, you might be ready to move the body, but you can't because people are on the track somewhere else. And so the thing I learned the most: stop trains entering the affected area. The turnbacks either side, and then you can start to do the service either side. And then people in control centres get fixated by the suicide. You know, the person under a train, all the cameras are on it. They're looking at it, thinking, "Oh, hang on, I think we get someone out." And I used to walk into my control centre and turn off the cameras and say, "Don't worry about that. You can't do anything about that. The fibre service are there. You know, the operating managers are there. The only thing you need to know is when they're ready to run again." And meanwhile, you should be focusing on these services, not having a good look at the CCTV because you can see the blood and gore.
Yeah.
But CBC railways are fast. You have to get straight in. You have to deal with it. If you dilly-dally for a minute, you could have two more trains stuck, one in each direction, because the capacity on that signalling is so good that trains will just keep leaving and going into, you know, a dead end, and then you've got more problems.
Yeah,
So I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I thought you just confirmed what you said you would disagree with. That the whole organization, the whole system needs to speed up because of your high capacity signaling. And this is a culture change. Yeah. And it includes, believe it or not, it includes the passengers. Yeah, the example that I keep coming up with is Sydney, when they introduced the first line of Sydney Metro. The terminus of the Sydney Metro line in Chatswood is a shared station where on the same platform, on the one side, you've got the existing Sydney train services on the North Shore line. On the other side, you've got Sydney Metro trains terminating. And between the two sides of the platform, you see huge differences in how the trains operate. One side has platform screen doors, the other side doesn't. How passengers board the trains and how trains close the door and just leave automatically, whereas on the other side there is still station staff trying to keep the passengers out from boarding the trains. So the differences between a legacy system, as I call it, and a high capacity system is tremendous, and it affects a lot of stuff, not just the signaling people, but the train controllers, the drivers, of course, if you still have drivers, the and the passengers. Yeah, the passengers that you have on an established high capacity railway, if you take, say, Singapore as an example, and you compare them with passengers on a legacy system, is hugely different. The passengers
Absolutely.
are faster. It's just between a city, a busy city, and a town. The people
No,
move faster. Yeah.
It's about the population and the culture of that country and that city. So if you go to Singapore, if you go to Hong Kong, if you go to places within Asia, customers don't disrespect the system. They wait for the next train. They don't throw up on a train. They don't throw litter. They don't throw cigarettes on the track. They don't trespass.
Yeah.
Culture of the country. And I think it's very difficult to re-educate people. I used to reply to customer complaints when I was more junior. So I'm sorry that train didn't wait for you, but it couldn't wait because the next train was 2 minutes behind and you have to wait for the next one. If we hold that train for you and delay it, you're delaying everything downstream, and that's not acceptable either. So I agree with that. I agree that staff need to be more on the ball. If you take CellTrack as a system, the driver gets a dwell countdown. So from when they open the door, they could have a value in seconds from a minimum to a maximum dwell. And the minimum and max can be varied. And at 9 seconds, the target point advances. So the driver, 9 seconds before departure, can say, these train doors are now closing, stand clear of the door. Mind will close the doors and press start on 0. And if they press start on 0, the train will arrive at the next station within 1 second of time. But what the CellTrack system does, it sees a journey from one end to the other as a series of small journeys. And so when it arrives in a station 5 seconds late, it will look for a run time to the next station that makes up that 5 seconds in 5 kph increments. And it will say, well, the nearest one is this, and it'll get there 2 seconds early. So I'm going to increase the dwell by 2 seconds. So if the driver then presses 0 on time, it will still arrive on time at the next station, having made up time or losing a bit of time for schedule. And so getting that into the drivers, so you'd have to wait for 0 to close, like you would wait for a signal to go green. You can preempt departure because you can see your target point advance at 9 seconds. In a busy interlocking, it's about 7 because several switches want to be called. On plain line, at 9 seconds, you get the departure. There's nothing to stop you leaving up to 9 seconds early. I mean, you could have preempted it. At 15 seconds, you could close up. And at 9 seconds, when you get the target point, press start. But then you're going to arrive at the next station 9 seconds early. The system's going to pull you back 9 seconds because all it wants you to be is right time throughout. And so the drivers can't beat the system over the length of the line. And so the systems are smart like that. But you need to train the staff to be confident that as you approach 0, press the start button and off you go. And if you have an unimpeded run to the next station, then you arrive within a second of time. And that's really cool. Bearing in mind that some subways only time to the half minute or the quarter minute, some of the suburban rail time to the nearest minute and may always round up. And so you think, that's interesting. What is the actual run time? What's the dwell? And in London, they used to have a different dwell for the peak and the off peak. So you could see the runtime vary in the peak being lengthened because the schedules team recognised it would take longer for a train to get from one end to the other in the peak, purely because of dwell times. Big change all around.
there is one big chunk of stuff that I haven't even addressed yet, where I definitely wanted to go. You told me in the pre-talk you've got a top 10 of do's and don'ts for CBTC projects. And I definitely would want to go into this rather in a separate episode or in this one, and maybe I cut it in half or something like that. So yeah,
Uh,
your top 10
I
of
go for
recommendations.
10. Well, I want to go full 10 now because that's going to take a while. And rather than just give them to you, there needs to be some context and some
Sure.
justification as to how to reach a conclusion. What I would do is do the top three. And I think the top three we can talk about now and we can enlarge on that because actually my next presentation will be the top 15. And in October at the Next Gen Train Control Conference in Baltimore this year, I'm doing a top 10 operation and maintenance considerations with Pete Tomlin, who now works for Kiewit, where we're taking the project management, the maintenance, and the operating and giving our 10 shared golden rules for brownfield CBTC. But the top three, and I think I've got them in order. The third one is practice, practice, practice. You know, you need to get control room staff, mechanics, signaling technicians, drivers as your test train operators, working under test rules, under the instruction of a lead tester, driving the trains, dispatching the trains, because those staff then learn about the system up front. It's not like suddenly you give them the car keys and you think, oh, you know, what am I going to do with it? And it's the people that will make the project work. The other number two is actually migration, migration, migration. I'm doing this from memory, so I apologize if they're wrong. And basically, you can look at a network. I mean, if anyone listening to this was to bring up now, say, the BART network in Oakland and San Francisco, or the Ramata network in DC, you'll see 5 or 6 lines, services interlinking in all sorts of octopus tentacles going out in all directions. And so if I gave you a start point, say for BART, and said you start at Millbrae, which is 1 away from the airport, and you can go anywhere you like, and then you follow the trunk section on the split, you can go this way or that way, and when you get to the next split, you go this way and that way. And there are probably 40 different ways of migrating. Some are better than others, and some are not so good. And you always want to start with the short first section, get your first 3 or 4 stations right before you spread the chaos, potentially. And then migration, as you increase each section, gets shorter and shorter between the sections because, as Pete Tomlin always reminds me, it's just a bit of extra code. It's more code of the same thing. You know, you're familiar with the trains are humming, the signaling's humming. It's just more guideway with more data about points and switches and so on. And so I think getting the migration improved will improve your chances. But the number one golden rule is it's all about the people. You can have the most magnificent CBC system by the best supplier in the world, really efficient, but it's the people who make it work. It's the people from the agency, the drivers, the maintainers, the station staff, the control room staff, the scheduling staff who write the timetables. It's the signaling supplier and their talented teams, often not in your city. And in our case, you know, for Line 1, we were dealing with Paris and Rochester and New York State. London Underground, we were dealing with Toronto. And so we have people embedded, but it was the people, it was the clever people and those less clever, but they had operational experience who made it work. Without the people, you're always going to have an uphill struggle. So you need to get them on board. You need to incentivize them. You need to have fun. And one of the reasons I left JNUT was I stopped having fun because doing the Northern Line after the Jubilee Line was actually respectfully quite boring because it was just more of the same. You know, we got burnt on the Jubilee and we were able to build all the lessons into the Northern on a rebaseline contract. We delivered it early on a pain share gain. So both Tallies and London Line benefited from the later stages being commissioned early. But it's the people, it's your contractors, it's your people you bring in to set up protection, it's your work car operators, it's your test train drivers, it's everybody at the agency pulling together will make a difference. If I flip that argument, you could have the most cruddy, crappy, I'm not allowed to say crappy, but there you go, CBTC system, but it's the people that will make it work and make the best of a bad job and can sometimes do really well. And unless you have the people on board and you empower them and you give them self-belief and you let them make some mistakes early in time and you correct them, you will deliver your CBTC system. It's all about the people, and I will never change that as my number one.
Yeah. And I can probably add from a supplier's point of view that it's a big misconception sometimes by the client, by the railway organization, to assume that the supplier at large is an expert in CBTC. And that's just not true. I mean, like in every organization, you've got some people that are particularly good, and then you've got a lot of people that are kind of okay to average, and then you've got some people that you don't really want on the project if you can avoid it. So the key, I believe, is really to make sure that you have access to the real specialist within the supplier organization. That doesn't mean that they can work full time on your project, because in most cases that's just not possible. If you look at a big supplier organization, you may find that the real gurus, the super specialists on that CBTC technology, there may be 3 or 4 worldwide, and you can see if the supplier has like 25 projects worldwide, they can't possibly have 3 or 4 of them all working on your project. Yeah, especially if you are not a top tier railway organization, but you are somewhere in the backwater like Australia. You can't expect the A team being on your project 24/7. That's just not working.
Yeah,
However,
and
if you run into projects, you want at least to be able to tap into those specialists just to troubleshoot. And then the project team can keep running with it.
so I think agencies are just as guilty. They think they know what to do with a CBC, having never done it, and so they go in their own direction. I wish them really luck. If you can crack it a different way, then knock yourself out. I don't like singling people out, but if you go back to JNUP, Walter Kineo from Thales, who's now their VP for Innovation, Steve Kelly, who's an SMT expert, these were heroes to us. They got it, they listened to us, they made the changes. So I agree with you, there are specialists on both sides, operators as well, maintainers, who should be listened to by the other side. I'm going to leave you, this might be a good thing to finish on, with a little anecdote from the summer of 2017, and the UITP World Congress was in Montreal. And I went to a workshop on CBTC, and 3 suppliers, 2 of whom I was familiar with and 1 I wasn't, each gave a presentation on CBTC, and then a 4th consultant did a kind of a benchmarking of cost per kilometre of different cities and systems. And at the end, it got to the Q&A, and I was in the back row. Often as a COO, you want to be in the back row slumped, unrecognizable, because every consultant and every supplier wants to talk to you about how their system's going to solve everything. So I was in the back row with a supplier, just keeping my head down. And the first question went to a signalling engineer from a company I may have mentioned, who said, the problem is operators don't know what they want. If they just listen to us, we would tell them what they want, and if they let us get on with it, we'd deliver their project. And he kind of went on for about 30 seconds, and I just saw red mist, which I rarely do. I never lose my temper at work, however much I come home and, I don't know, smash the place up. And so when he ran out of steam, I just tapped him on the shoulder and said, my turn. And I went, I'm Mike Palmer. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Toronto Commission, and I do know what I want. You don't listen to what I want, and I know what I want, and I've done it before. So I do kind of a 20 seconds. I mean, he makes the mistake of coming back and answering, kind of toning it down a bit. And after he'd done his second bit, I did my Obama drop the mic moment. I said, listen, we can fight this out in the bar later, which is always a good idea. But this is how it works. I'm the customer, you're the supplier. If you don't give me what I want, I won't give you the work. And I walked away from the mic. And what it made me really think about, and it's the topic of my my paper at the RSE convention in Toronto next month, 26th to 30 August, and the President Jane Power has invited me to do this presidential lecture on the role of the operator in signalling projects, specifically CBTC. But it really gave me thought about, do we know what we want? And the answer is not always. We don't always know, or it might be wrong. But at least hear us out and give us a good reason why we shouldn't do it. But that exchange, which was probably 2 minutes in total, just really made me think about, I mean, I've been blessed. I've worked on 3 projects. That experience is probably fairly unique in the world. But it makes me quite opinionated, as you may have noticed in this podcast. But it's because I've done it and I've seen it and I've got burnt and I've learned from it and I've been able to hone my ideas on it. And I think sometimes suppliers forget that, and they just think they can, treat you as a mug and rip you off, which is unfair on most of them. But for some, I think there's some validity. And to be across the table, from the Mikes and the Doc Franks, is daunting because we might actually know what we're doing, and we've done it before, not once, not twice, but I've done it 3 times now. And I'm helping agencies in North America go about it the right way. And that's kind of quite exciting, even in my older years.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thank you very much. I had a blast. I hope the listeners had as well. And I am carefully looking forward, if you're game, to bring you back later on to listen to your top tips number 4 to 15. Maybe after you've done the presentation in Philly, so not to steal your thunder there.
Well, it's actually in Baltimore this year. We changed city for
I'm
the first time.
in Baltimore. Okay, good. Well, whatever. By the way, if you give me the link to that conference, I will probably do a plug for it in the show notes.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's 17th and 18th of October in Baltimore, and Pete Tomlin and I will be doing a joint paper on 10 or 15 operational maintenance and project considerations for brownfield CBTC. And the other thing is we've talked about me appearing in your next World Congress convention for CBTC, and I'd love to speak at that as well for you. But I think people would disagree with things I've said, and that's fine. I'm not the oracle, the definitive on this, but hopefully some of what I've said resonates with people, and they think, yeah, might have a point there, and that's fine. And I'm sure people will reach out to me, and I always like a good discussion, normally over a beer, which is not possible necessarily online. But we're all very different, and I don't want to upset anybody. I'm very respectful of the suppliers. I'm very respectful of the agencies. I'm respectful of consultancies, and I'm respectful of people who know what they're doing, and more cautious about those who don't.
Excellent closing words, Mike Palmer. Thank you very much, and hopefully I get you again on the show soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I would just point out it's 74 degrees here and I'm wearing a shirt. I've got shorts on which you can't see. At least I made the effort to dress up with my cufflinks and everything, Frank. But it was great to talk to you. We go back to that conference in February 2014, and it's been a blast. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good morning for you, good evening for me, and I'm off to have a salad.
Hi, this is Doc Frank again. Before you head off, I just wanted to let you know again of the arguably best CBTC conference that has ever been held, the CBTC World Summit 2023, with 18 speakers from 13 different countries. It was a mega event in September this year, and you now have access to the official recording where you can see all the presentations, all the question and answers after the presentations, and even the VIP Fireside chats that were exclusively for VIP attendees during the conference. But you can have all of this now lifelong on demand. You can watch it whenever you want, from wherever you want, and how often you want. Don't miss this opportunity and sign up to the best CBTC conference ever on docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC World Summit 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC World Summit 2023. If you want one recommendation from me on CBTC, that is it. The best content of the year by a mile. Don't miss it. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share, and until next time, keep it simple, and bye for now. Thank you for listening.